Welcome to Serial Napper, the bedtime podcast for people who fall asleep to true crime. This episode gets dark, so if you're sensitive to graphic content, maybe skip the nightcap. You've been warned. Hey everyone, my name is Nikki Young, and this is Serial Napper, the true crime podcast for naps. I'm back with another true crime story to lull you to sleep, or perhaps to give you nightmares. It's finally here, Halloween night, which means that this is the last episode of Serial Nightmare, the special series that I do every year for Halloween. And if you're a parent, that also means hauling around a half-frozen coffee while your kid sprints from door to door, collecting a year's worth of sugar in one night. And when you finally get home, the real ritual begins, sifting through the mountain of candy, checking for anything suspicious, and quietly pocketing your favorites before handing it all back. Most of us do it for the fun, a little nostalgia, a little quality control, because the thought of someone actually tampering with candy to hurt a child, it's unthinkable. Something that sounds too cruel for any human being to be capable of doing. But here's the thing, it did happen. And the man responsible didn't just shatter one family. He ruined Halloween for every family that came after. His name was Ronald O'Bryan, a father from Texas who became known as the Candyman Killer. He's the reason parents still inspect every chocolate bar and say things like, "Don't eat anything that looks opened," or "Let mom check it first." That urban legend, it's not a legend at all. It's a true story. And tonight, we're going to unwrap it. So, dim the lights, put your phone down, and listen to the story of how the Candyman Killer, Ronald O'Bryan, did something so cruel, he destroyed Halloween forever for his victims. So, let's jump right in. It's October 31st, 1974 in Pasadena, Texas. Halloween night, my favorite. The O'Bryan family had big plans for the evening. Dinner with their friends, the Bates family, followed by an evening of trick-or-treating with the kids. Ronald O'Bryan, father, husband, and self-proclaimed family man, had arranged it all earlier that week with his friend Jim Bates. The O'Bryans lived in a modest townhouse community in Deer Park, but the Bates family, they lived in a fancier part of Pasadena. And you know how it goes. The nicer the neighborhood, the bigger the candy bars. So that's where they decided to go trick-or-treating for the night. The plan was simple. The dads, Ronald and Jim, would take the kids out for candy, while the wives stayed behind to hand some out. The little candy crew included 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth O'Bryan, plus the Bates kids, Mark and Kimberly. 4 kids, 2 dads, and a mission: hit as many houses as humanly possible before bedtime. The streets were alive that night with kids running door to door, dressed as ghosts, witches, and whatever superheroes didn't require too much parental effort. The air smelled like popcorn, cheap rubber masks, and sugar. Pasadena was buzzing. After a few stops, the group arrived at 4112 Donerail Street, home of the Marvin family. The house was dark, porch light off. You know the drill. That's the universal Halloween signal for no candy here. Usually you skip those houses altogether, but before either of the dads could say anything, the kids bolted up the walkway and rang the doorbell anyway. No answer. After about 30 seconds, the kids shrugged it off and ran to the next house, laughing, already planning their next score. But Ronald stayed behind, which was kind of weird. What was he going to do? Stand there until someone magically appeared with a bowl of candy? Jim Bates and the kids, they kept moving, assuming that Ronald would catch up, and eventually he did. When Ronald rejoined them a few houses down, he was grinning, holding 5 giant Pixy Stix in his hands. "You've got rich neighbors," he joked to Jim. "Look what they're giving out. 5 21-inch sugar straws, every kid's dream, every dentist's nightmare." Now, if you've never had a Pixy Stick before, first of all, I'm really sorry for your childhood. They're basically paper tubes filled with powdered sugar and artificial fruit flavoring. You tear off the top and you pour it straight into your mouth. It's pure crazy in candy form, and these weren't the regular ones. These were the jumbo, king-size versions, the holy grail of trick-or-treat loot. Ronald offered to hang onto the Pixy Stix for now, saying that he'd divide them up when they got back to the Bates house. Fair enough. Dads usually get stuck carrying everything anyway. Later, when they returned to the Bates home, he made good on his word. Ronald handed 1 Pixy Stix each to 2 of his kids, Timothy and Elizabeth, and the 2 Bates children. The 5th went to an 11-year-old boy named Whitney Parker, a kid from their church who just happened to stop by trick-or-treating while Ronald was handing them out. He obviously didn't want to leave this child out, so he gave Whitney one as well. And with that, the night wound down. The kids were tired, the sugar bags were full, and the O'Bryans said goodnight to the Bates family. Daneen O'Bryan, Ronald's wife, decided to stop by a friend's house before heading home, while Ronald took Timothy and Elizabeth back himself to get them into their jammies and into bed. The night had gone exactly as planned, or so it seemed. But that handful of Pixy Stix that Ronald carried from that dark porch, it was about to turn Halloween into a horror story that still haunts parents to this day. Back at the O'Bryan house, the kids were buzzing with that sugar rush excitement, dumping their candy onto the living room floor and sorting it into keepers and trade bait. You know the drill: chocolate over gummies. Full-size bars are currency, and anything with raisins, well, that goes straight to mom and dad. But Donald decided that it was getting too late for a ton of sugar, so he made the ultimate parental decree. Each kid could have 1 piece of candy before bed. For an 8-year-old, that's practically torture, according to my own children anyway. Ronald later claimed that Timothy, sweet, excited 8-year-old Timothy, chose one of the giant Pixy Stix as his candy of choice. Whether that's true or not, we'll never really know, but that's what Ronald said happened. The Pixy Stix, weirdly, was stapled shut. Timothy had trouble getting it open, and he couldn't shake the powder loose. Ronald, ever the helpful dad, took it, and he rolled it between his hands to loosen it up. The sugary powder finally slid down the tube, and Timothy poured some into his mouth. Almost immediately, he said it tasted bitter, which, if you've ever had Pixy Stix, it's not the vibe. Ronald handed him a glass of Kool-Aid to wash it down. Just 30 seconds later, Timothy started to complain that his stomach hurt. Ronald would later say, quote, 30 seconds after I left Tim's room, I heard him cry, "Daddy, Daddy." Timothy ran to the bathroom, where he began to vomit and convulse on the floor. Ronald said he rushed in to hold his son, but within moments, the boy went limp in his arms. Paramedics arrived on scene quickly, but there was nothing that they could do. Timothy O'Bryan was pronounced dead on the way to the hospital, less than an hour after eating that Pixy Stix candy. At first, no one could process it. A random Halloween poisoning? It sounded like one of those urban legends parents used to scare kids into brushing their teeth. But the autopsy confirmed the unthinkable. Timothy had ingested cyanide, enough to kill several adults. When investigators analyzed the candy, what they found was horrifying. The Pixy Stix had been opened, 2 inches of the original powder dumped out, and replaced with potassium cyanide, then resealed with a staple. Every single one of the 5 tubes had been tampered with in the same way. Police immediately scrambled to recover the other 4 Pixy Stix. Thank God none of the other kids had eaten theirs. The family of the other little boy who had been given one had a terrifying moment where they couldn't find the candy, only to discover their son asleep in bed, still holding it in his hand. He hadn't been able to open it because of that same stubborn staple. That tiny frustration saved his life. The picture was starting to come together, and it wasn't some Halloween maniac randomly poisoning candy. This was something far more personal. Timothy's death wasn't an accident. It was a plan, and soon the man everyone thought was a devoted father would become the face of every parent's worst nightmare. Police went into overdrive. They had to move fast. If one kid's candy had been poisoned, well, there could be more out there. Detectives traced every single step Ronald O'Bryan took that Halloween night, knocking on doors, interviewing homeowners, piecing together the trick-or-treat route like a crime scene map. But something felt off from the very start. Nobody remembered giving out Pixy Stix. Not one house, not one person. The only one who claimed to have them was Ronald. The cops were polite at first. It was a tragedy after all, but when they dug deeper, the story stopped making any kind of sense. Ronald told investigators that he remembered a dark house where the owner had opened the door just a crack, just enough to pass out 5 giant Pixy Stix, and that he'd only seen the man's arm, which he described as hairy. Creepy visual, sure, but police couldn't find any evidence that this hairy-armed Candyman actually existed. Ronald even joined them, walking up and down the neighborhood to try to remember which house it was. Finally, he pointed to one, the same dark home he'd lingered at while the kids ran ahead. That house belonged to a man named Courtney Melvin. He was an air traffic controller who, conveniently, wasn't even home that night on Halloween night. He had worked until 11 p.m., which the airport confirmed down to the very minute. So, there went that story. Meanwhile, as police talked to more people in the neighborhood, things started to sound even more suspicious. Again, no one had handed out Pixy Stix that night. In fact, most people didn't even have them in their homes. And Jim Bates, Ronald's friend who had been trick-or-treating with him that night, he told investigators that Ronald's behavior had been weird. He said Ronald was acting really jumpy, distracted, and when they got back to the house later that night, Ronald even lunged across the table to stop one of the Bates kids from eating their Pixy Stix, which, looking back, was probably the only decent thing that he did that night. Then came the phone call that blew everything open. A few days after Timothy's funeral, an insurance agent contacted the police with some disturbing information. He said Ronald had recently taken out multiple life insurance policies on both of his children, without his wife's knowledge. The first policy had been taken out in January, $10,000 for each child. Just a few months later, another $20,000 policy for each. And then, just days before Halloween, Ronald added yet another $20,000 per child. That's a grand total of $50,000 for each child. And remember, this was 1974 money, so that value of $50,000, that's more like $350,000. The timing wasn't very subtle. When police started peeling back the layers of Ronald's life, the picture came into sharp, ugly focus. He was drowning in debt, over $100,000, which would be more than $500,000 today. He was behind on car payments, the family home was in foreclosure, and he was on the verge of being fired from his job at Texas State Optical for suspected theft. The so-called family man that everyone knew from church, he was neck deep in financial ruin. And then came the final nail in the coffin. On the morning after Timothy's death, before his body was even buried, Ronald O'Bryan called his insurance company to ask about how to collect on the payout on his son's policies. Not suspicious at all, right? Just a totally normal thing for a grieving father to do. Less than 12 hours after his child had died in agony, this man was already chasing the money. And that was suspicious. Now, at that point, the police knew exactly what they were dealing with. The question wasn't if Ronald O'Bryan had killed his son, it was why he thought he could get away with it. Ronald O'Bryan's grieving father routine started to crumble. Coworkers came forward saying that he'd been bragging about something big coming his way, that he was going to get rich soon, which, considering his financial situation, was probably the least subtle way to announce premeditated murder. When the police searched the O'Bryan home, they found a small chemistry kit and traces of cyanide powder. That's when the story got darker. As it turned out, Ronald had been doing research on things that will make your stomach turn. In the weeks before Halloween, he'd taken an interest in poison. At work, one of his clients was a chemist, and Ronald casually started asking him questions about potassium cyanide, what it does, how it works, and most importantly, where to get it. He even stopped by a local chemical supply store, pretending to need it for testing purposes. But he left empty-handed when he found out that he couldn't buy it in small amounts, because apparently he didn't want to waste money on extra cyanide that he didn't need. Because, budgeting is important when you're planning filicide. Police couldn't determine exactly where he eventually got his supply, but they believed he managed to score a smaller quantity right before Halloween, enough to kill several people. And that's apparently what he intended to do. Ronald hadn't just planned to kill his son. He had planned to potentially poison 5 children: Timothy, Elizabeth, the 2 Bates kids, and the other child. They were all meant to die so that it would look random, so that Ronald could cash in on his insurance money while pretending to be just another devastated parent caught in a community tragedy. Maybe he thought after his own child died that the others would be spared because the candy would just get thrown out. Risky, but that was a chance he was apparently willing to take. Either way, he wanted it to look like bad luck, just another urban legend come true. But there was no mythical Candyman lurking in the dark that Halloween night. There was only Ronald O'Bryan, the man who tried to disguise murder as misfortune and who ended up destroying Halloween for everyone else. The police had their man, and soon the entire country would too. By November 5th, 1974, less than a week after Timothy's death, police were done playing nice. They showed up at the O'Bryan home with an arrest warrant, charging Ronald with 1 count of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. When they sat him down in the interrogation room, Ronald stuck to his story. He didn't do it. Somebody else must have tampered with the candy. Right, the mythical neighborhood boogeyman again. He denied everything, and he pleaded not guilty, because reality was never really his strong suit. But the evidence was stacked against him. During a search of the O'Bryan home, investigators found his pocket knife with traces of plastic and Pixy Stix powder still on the blade, exactly what he would have used to cut open and reseal the candy tubes. Beyond the physical evidence, the testimony at trial painted a picture of a man whose greed had consumed every last shred of his humanity. Coworkers said he'd been obsessed with cyanide, peppering them with questions in the weeks before Halloween. A local chemist confirmed that Ronald had asked him about potassium cyanide, how much it would take to kill someone, where to buy it, all those lovely dinner table topics. Even Ronald's wife, Daneen, took the stand against him. She told the court that Ronald's story just didn't add up, that he'd practically forced Timothy to eat the Pixy Stix that night, not the other way around. Remember, Ronald's big claim was that Timothy chose it himself as his one piece of candy before bed. But his wife made it clear that was a lie. Ronald made Timothy choose the Pixy Stix. So why hand out poisoned candy to 4 other children? If Timothy was his only intended victim, why take that risk? Investigators said that it was part of his cover. Ronald wanted to make it look random, like one of those Halloween horror stories like parents whisper about. If only Timothy had been poisoned, suspicion would have been pointed straight at him. By spreading the tainted candy, he was trying to disguise murder as misfortune. But the act didn't hold up for long. The media went wild. Reporters dubbed him the Candyman, the father who'd murdered Halloween itself. The trial was front-page news across the country. On June 3rd, 1975, it took the jury just 45 minutes to find Ronald O'Bryan guilty and another 70 minutes to sentence him to death. His appeals dragged on for years, every one of them denied. His wife divorced him shortly after the trial and refused to ever visit him on death row, fully convinced of his guilt. She later remarried. Ronald sat on death row for years, during which he tried to reinvent himself as a wronged man of faith. He gave interviews, he quoted scripture, and he maintained his innocence until the very end. But no one bought it, not after the evidence, the motive, and the complete lack of remorse. Nearly 10 years after he killed his 8-year-old son with cyanide-laced candy, Ronald O'Bryan's time finally ran out. On March 31st, 1984, he was executed by lethal injection, a much kinder death than the one that he had given Timothy. Outside the prison, a crowd gathered. Some came dressed in Halloween costumes, chanting "Trick or treat." Others held signs that read, "Kill the Candyman." If irony had a face, well, that was it. Before the drugs took effect, Ronald delivered one final performance. He said, quote, "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong. I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death." And that was the end of Ronald O'Bryan, a man who poisoned his own son for money, and in doing so, poisoned an entire holiday for generations to come. After this case, the myth of poisoned Halloween candy exploded. Every generation since has heard some version of it. Check your candy. Don't eat anything that looks opened. Someone out there is trying to kill you. But the truth? It wasn't some stranger. It wasn't a neighbor lurking behind a curtain with a vial of poison. It was a father, a man who saw his child's life as a dollar sign. That's the real horror of this story. Not what's in the candy, but who's holding the bag. In the years that followed, the entire community of Pasadena changed. Parents refused to let their kids go trick-or-treating. Porch lights stayed off. Costumes gathered dust. And honestly, who could blame them? For a while, Halloween wasn't spooky fun, it was just spooky. Even now, every year, stories start popping up online. Posts from terrified parents claiming that their kids got tainted candy or found a razor blade in a chocolate bar. It's always viral. It's always scary. But the vast majority of them, usually hoaxes. Usually, it turns out to be someone tampering with their own candy just to get attention, which, let's be real, is deeply messed up. Or someone just pulling a prank that went too far. Occasionally, there is a legitimate manufacturing mishap where something weird ends up in a candy wrapper, but the odds of your Reese's being rigged are about the same as winning the lottery while being struck by lightning. Still, the fear stuck. It burrowed deep into the cultural bloodstream because Ronald O'Bryan's crime proved that sometimes monsters really do hide in plain sight. And he wasn't even the first person to make a mess of Halloween candy. In 1959, years before Ronald's stunt, a California dentist named William Shine decided to teach kids a lesson. He dropped little white heart-shaped pills into trick-or-treat bags. Laxatives. About 450 bags were handed out, and around 30 kids ended up sick or at least stuck in the bathroom for a few days. Shine was later charged with outrage of public decency and unlawful dispensing of drugs. Then in 1964, a 47-year-old woman from Greenlawn, New York named Helen handed out quote-unquote treats that included traps, steel wool pads, and dog biscuits. When police asked why, she said she didn't mean it maliciously. She was just annoyed by the Halloween custom. Which, okay, maybe just skip the decorations next time and keep your porch light off. She was later committed to a state hospital for mental observation. Fast forward to the year 2000, Minneapolis, Minnesota, a man named James J. Smith thought it would be hilarious to stick sewing needles into Snickers bars. One kid bit into one and got a nasty mouth injury, but thankfully, no one was killed. And that's the pattern: fear without fatalities. In all the decades since Timothy O'Brien's death, there's never been another confirmed child death from tainted Halloween candy. Not one. Because the danger usually isn't out there in the dark, out in the neighborhood, out in the community. It's usually closer to home, especially when we're talking about the death of children. Ronald O'Bryan used his son's favorite holiday, something meant to be fun, innocent, magical. He used it as camouflage for murder. And that's why we still can't shake it. Every time a parent hovers over a candy pile, double-checking wrappers, they're not really afraid of poisoned chocolates. They're afraid of what Ronald O'Bryan proved, that sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones behind the horror. Timothy went trick-or-treating with his hero, and he came home with his killer. So, this Halloween, when you're sorting through that mountain of sugar, maybe give your Snickers an extra glance. Not because there's poison hiding inside, but because the story behind that fear never really died. That's it for me tonight. If you want to reach out, you can find me on Facebook, I'm on Threads, I'm on TikTok, I'm on YouTube, I'm just about everywhere that you listen to podcasts and on social media. If you're looking for ad-free bonus episodes, check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/serialnapper. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and if a stranger offers you candy, maybe just keep walking. Bye.